Okay, so let's start by saying that just by introducing this symposium, it's one of the series Think Open Rovereto Symposium, where Think Open at CIMeC, the Open Science Initiative at CIMeC, organizes these short events where 2 or 3 people from international community they try to discuss several approaches related to open science. Today we have Stefano, Moia, and Adina Wagner going to introduce them to you in a few seconds. This is the first symposium for 2022. And today we're going to talk about version control for scientific research using Git and GitHub. This will be it's not to be, as all the symposium, a theoretical symposium, so where speakers illustrate concepts instead of explaining how to do things. But on the other hand, this specific event will be focused on interesting practical aspects that you could use in your everyday research routine. I just want to point out a very specific aspect of this event. I'm really glad that these 2 speakers accepted to present here virtually in CIMeC. And I have to say, I think this is like the 12 or 15 event within the Think Open at CIMeC initiative. But these 2 speakers, they put so much effort in this event, preparing the slides, discussing which would be the best approach for the audience, suggesting questions to ask people, participating in the Twitter interview. So thanks, Adina and Stefano, for your proactivity, for your enthusiasm. And I'm 100% sure that these 2 talks will be just extraordinary, very relevant for your everyday research routine. So let's introduce first Stefano, which is a postdoc researcher at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, where he's currently developing open science packages to analyze the link between structural and functional connector in stroke. He's also the project manager of PhysioPy, a GitHub-based international collaboration of researchers that develop open science tools to spread the use of psychological data in functional MRI studies. When he's not coding, he's probably in the kitchen cooking. So, Stefano, floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, for the invitation and the introduction, and for raising the bar high. So now I have to respect the new standard. That's great. All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. As Vittorio said, I'm Stefano Moia. I'm currently working at the EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, and collaborating internationally with a bunch of colleagues doing fun physiological data imaging and trying to introduce physiological data using in MRI experiments. Today, I'm not here to talk to you about these things, though. I'm here to talk to you about version control systems, and in particular, the Git workflow. We're gonna then see what it takes to go public with your projects, for instance, adding licenses, adding a DOI to your project, and adding contributors. And then we're going to see a little bit about automations, how to put together a CI/CD workflow or continuous integration, continuous deployment, how to do tests, and how to do releases.
Sorry, Stefano. I guess we are experiencing, I don't know, there are the black bars, the Zoom objects over the slides. I don't know if it's just me. Yeah.
Sorry.
That one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there is like a strange combination of keys that allow you to hide controls.
I don't think I can.
Okay. I think it's fair enough. In this way, it's fair. It's fair enough.
I'm very sorry about that.
No problem.
All right. Yeah, I don't know why, but my Zoom doesn't allow me to just share the single screen, the single caption. So I have to share the whole screen, and probably that's why you see some stuff. I hope it's not be too disturbing for you.
No, it's okay.
I'm gonna try to put them as away as I can. Yeah, okay. I can put them more or less here, and I hope you will not see them anymore. But bear with it if you do. All right, let's talk about version control system and Git workflows. So I am quite sure that you are familiar with at least one of the situations that I'm presenting here. Either a piece of code that was commented a bit too much because the author didn't want to change or at least remove something that they did bit back in time to keep a little bit of history of the document, but also not to commit too much to a certain change. By the way, that's my code 6 years ago when I was still a student. I am sure that you've been at least working with somebody that keeps the same file multiple times in the same folder with slightly different names to talk about different versions. Or I'm sure that you had a colleague that said at a certain point, oh, I'm so frustrated. I'm stuck on this project because I'm waiting for my colleague to finish working on this part of the project that is nothing to do with my part of the project, but I cannot work together at the same time on the same thing, can I? If you have been in one of those situations, first of all, know that I understand you. I've been there as well. And second of all, I want you to know that it's a very good sign that you need to use version control systems for your projects. I know that version control systems might sound something quite exotic. They might sound something quite nerdy, and they might sound like you have to stay in front of a terminal, putting in a bunch of quite strange and not always very easy to understand commands that you need to remember by heart. And that can be scary and that can be complicated. I'm here to tell you, don't worry too much. Version control is not just that. Version control is not just there. That's not just because nowadays you can use different tools to access version control systems and especially Git. But that's also because probably you have been working with version control already without knowing it. For instance, if you work with Google Docs, you might not have known that, but there's always the possibility to check the chronology of versions, of previous versions that you changed. And for instance, you can go in the menu, check the history of your changes, and track back to previous versions of your documents, to different points in time, and even revert changes that were done, or at least see who did them. And I'm sure you've been in Wikipedia. And if you do that, there's a tab in your pages that's called View History. And that's exactly what it does. It checks the history of the document that you're consulting, telling you what has been changed, when, and by whom. And that's very important to not only have a track of the history of your document, but also to adapt and check authorship. And for instance, say, oh, this person actually didn't do a good change, or this person did a great change. We should see more about that. Now, version controls are exactly that. Version control systems are a way to manage and track changes to files. We've been seeing 2 examples, but here today we're talking more about Git. Git is a software that you install on your computers and that does version control for you. And we're also going to talk about Github. Github is a website. It's a tool that helps you navigating through repositories initialized with Git. I know it can be confusing, and you might think that Git and GitHub are the same thing. And I would understand you, mainly because they have very similar names and they seem to be more or less the same thing. In order to make you understand better what is the difference between the two, I want you to give you an analogy. Think about the difference between Git and GitHub as the difference between videos and YouTube. YouTube is a website, is an aggregation delivery system that will provide you access and give you access to videos. And videos are the content of YouTube. And it's the same for GitHub and Git. GitHub is a website that will provide you access to various repositories that are initialized with Git. And those repositories initialized with Git are the content of GitHub. Now, Git is actually the software that you use to initialize those repositories and do version control, but the analogy is more or less there. Now, it's important to note that Git is not the only version control systems out there, at least for your local environment. There's another one that is quite famous, and it's called Mercurio. And GitHub is not the only system out there in the World Wide Web that you can use to track and aggregate and delivery repositories. Other examples are, for instance, Bitbucket and GitLab. And I want to mention particularly GitLab in this moment because that's an open source software development project that you can even install locally and have a version control system with interaction and with further improvements in a local server, for instance, in your university. And you might actually have that already and you might not know it. So check it out with your IT team. Now, I know that some of you are familiar with the Git workflow and the classic GitHub workflow. Bear with me for a moment. You can tune out for like 10 minutes and come back when you see a blue screen and a green screen. But for those of you that are not so familiar with the classic GitHub workflow, let's go through it a little bit together in order to get familiar with some of the syntax and the terminology of Git. So what happens normally is that we have a folder, it contains document, it contains code, it doesn't matter, but we want to track it. We want to start seeing changes and doing version control with it. So what we would do with Git is to initialize that project, that folder, in order to create a repository that will create automatically a main or a master branch. That branch is a tool that the version control system will use to track the changes to your project, your folder. Now, what we normally do is we don't just operate on the folder itself. We want to normally work on a copy of that project in order to maintain a safe copy of that project working without any issue. In order to do that, we will create a new branch. For instance, in this case, I call my branch dev development. And by creating this branch, we will obtain a perfect copy of main that we will be able to change and do contributions on. Once you create this branch, you can do your changes, you can save them, but Git will not know automatically what's happening. You will have to tell Git, hey, I did a change. I want you to take track of it. I want you to remember it. And in order to do that, you will commit those changes to the branch. Now, Git is like your best friend when your best friend is very reliable, but is not always paying attention to you. That's because there's a lot of things that are happening in the background that you might not want to save to history all the time. But the important things must be there. And for those to be there, you need to tell Git to commit them and to take track of them. Once you did your commits and you did your changes and you check that everything is right and you want to give back those changes to the main branch, it's time for you to merge the new dev branch into main. And doing that will bring all of the changes that you did in dev into main without an issue. What happens is that, for instance, you might not be working alone on a project, or you might be working alone, but you're working on this super nice new chapter in your thesis or your super nice new function at the end of your data analysis. And you realize that there's something before that was wrong and that you need to change as soon as possible. For instance, a bug in your preprocessing of the data or a different grammar mistake in your previous chapter of the thesis. You can do that at the same time as your new development. It's not a big deal. You just need to pause for a second your new development, open a new branch, again from main, create a new branch, do your changes and everything, and then you can merge your new branch into main again. Doing that will create a diverging main with dev. That's because you did changes to the main branch that you saved and you're tracking, but the version of the main branch that the development branch came from and wants to merge back in is not the same anymore. Sometimes this is not a problem absolutely. Git will automatically help you in doing everything so that you will not even realize that there was a conflict. You will not even realize that that was a problem. Some other time it can happen that you're working exactly on a same piece of code or on the same chapter of your document, and that will create a conflict. Now, you need to solve that conflict in order to be able to continue with your development. In order to do that, you will normally merge your main branch into your development branch, the branch you're working in. Git will help you solving those conflicts, showing you the differences and helping you selecting the best option for each one of them. And then you will be able to merge again, dive into main and continue with your process. Now, I hope it's clear up until now. I'm going to add a little bit of complication to this story. Normally, what we do is working on a system, a repository, together with other people. When that happens, we normally have a main repository that comes before everything else, and that is normally the one that is least touched by everybody. That's the upstream repository. We call it upstream to indicate that it comes before everything else. And this could be, for instance, the main repository for community, or a repository your colleagues worked on before you, but since you're inheriting their project or you want to use their project for something else, maybe a preprocessing that they did that you want to adopt as well, but changing some stuff, you can take that as the upstream repository. What you would do is create a copy of that upstream that is yours. We call it forking. So you fork upstream into your new repository. We call that repository that is yours origin, because that's where your work originates from. And when you do that, you get a perfect copy of upstream for you to work on. You will then create your changes, open new branches from origin. And once you're happy with those changes, maybe you don't want to give anything back to upstream. Maybe you want to keep it in origin. That's fine. You do exactly what we discussed about before. If you want to get those changes into upstream to give back something that you take from, you have to create a pull request. That normally becomes a process because there's more than one person involved. There's going to be a discussion. There's going to be some revision and some collaboration. But it's a very fun process and you can learn a lot from it. And it's very important to go through it because it will help you and your group to check that the changes that you're doing make sense. Now, it can happen that somebody else or maybe your previous colleague is working on upstream and will do some changes. Once again, you will need to bring those changes to you and then merge those changes to your development branch. In order to do that, in this case, you will bring those changes to you. We call this process pooling. So you will pull those changes to your origin from upstream. You will then merge your origin main branch into your development branch, and then you will continue on. Now, I hope it's clear because I'm going to add another complication to the story, but that's the final one and it's going to make everything more clear. What I talked about up until now happens online, happens on the World Wide Web, on GitHub, on GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever you want. But you normally work on your computer, on your local system, and that's where you use Git to do all of these actions instead. And it's important to know that the first time that, for instance, you use a computer, or the first time that you want to work on repository on your computer, would that be your workstation at your workplace or your laptop when you go around, you need to create a local version of your origin repository. In that case, we talk about cloning, meaning that you're creating a local repository of a remote repository. So you will clone origin to your local workstation. You will then work on your local workstations, creating branches and everything that we talked about before. And when you want to bring some changes that were done remotely to your local repository, you will do a pull. So you will pull those changes to your local from origin or upstream. And when you want to send the changes that you did locally remotely, you would push those changes. You will send those changes remotely. We call it pushing. And it will send those changes normally to origin and then do everything that we did, what we said we were going to do before, as we did before. Now, this can seem a complex workflow, but it's actually very easy to adopt, very easy to understand once you start doing it. And it becomes quite natural when you start adding it to your routine. It helps you because it will keep a version of your repository online that can be accessed wherever you go, from whatever computer you want. It will help you because it will keep you and your colleagues checking each other's code and tracking the changes. But especially it will help you because it will keep the history of your files. And that's very nice, not just because, as we've seen before with Wikipedia, that helps you understanding who did what in your repository. For instance, in this case, we see that a colleague of mine added a full function to these files that I was checking earlier on. But it's also very important if you're working alone, because, for instance, you can talk to your past self, or better, your past self can talk to you. And it can help you remind that you did that change that day for that reason. For instance, here you see that I've been working on a repository for more than 3 years, and sometimes I don't remember what I did or why I did it. And it's important to go back, check what I wrote that I did, the changes that I did, and that can help you remembering and tracking what you did. And if at any point I want to revert those changes, I can without any problem. And please notice that this is not a terminal. This is one of those programs that I was talking about before that you can use currently to interface with Git very easily. So the first thing that I want you to take home today is that working with GitHub can be challenging, but it allows you to work in parallel on new features without disrupting a main version of your project, which is very nice when you have a very important project that you want to keep safe. And it will also help you track changes in time. And as a bonus, it will also force your team to double check your projects and your developments and your changes. We'll be seeing what version control systems are and how a Git workflow works. If you are putting your work on GitHub, you might think about making your repositories public. In that case, there are some things that you might want to do. For instance, licensing it, adding an identifier, adding a DOI, and then interfacing with some contributors. Let's start talking about the license, because this is one of the things that we tend to not worry too much about, but it's actually a very important step of making a repository and some work public. Paradoxically, you can put everything online. You can make everybody access to what you do, but if you don't put a license to that work will not be actually public. And that's because there is no rules to regulate the interaction of people with that piece of work, with that repository. Savvy people will normally stay away from a project that is not licensed because they don't know how to interface with that. When I see, for instance, a project that is not licensed that I want to work with, or maybe I want to take some parts of for my other projects, I normally write to the author first and say, hey, look, I didn't see that any license to your work. Can I use it? Is it okay? How should I do that? How do you want me to recognize your work before? Sometimes this doesn't happen, and some people might just want to steal what you did without recognizing everything and maybe adding a license themselves, maybe commercial, which will basically prevent you from doing anything anymore with what you were doing. That's not nice. Luckily, it's very easy to add a license to your projects. GitLab and GitHub both have lists of licenses that you can easily add to your project and your repositories. But if you want to have a bit more explanation of what those licenses are, or if you want to have more options, there's this website that is called Choose a License that very originally will help you choosing a license for your projects. These licenses are not just project licenses related to code. They can also be documents. And if you want a list of licenses and you want to see the differences between licenses, there's many pages with many trackers and short description of the licenses and many lists that will tell you what are the differences between licenses. When I work with science, I personally like to work with Apache 2 when I do code, and when I do publications, the Creative Commons by non-derivatives number 4 license. Because we can talk about more later about them, but it's mainly because those are the licenses that are more similar to a scientific workflow and interaction, let's say. You can also consider different licenses if you want to have a look at the lesser GPL license and the general Creative Commons CC BY 4 license as well. One thing that you might be wanting to do as a favor to yourself is adding a license during your first commits of your repository. Don't wait for your repository to be finished before adding the license. That's because, as I said before, Git tracks history and makes that history public. And sometimes people can access to that history. And if there is no license to that previous history, well, then they can basically do whatever they want with the code that was before the license, or even just disregard your project entirely because there was no license whatsoever. It's also important to notice that some licenses are not implemented already as soon as you put them in your repository. It's good to read those licenses because sometimes those licenses say that you need to add some informative code or some informative commands to each one of your files for those licenses to be actually effective. So please have a look at them and respect them yourself. The second thing that you want to do, especially if you're working in science, is making your project identifiable, adding a DOI to it in order for other people to be able to cite it. And as a person that works in software development for science, please, when you use some software that somebody else did, please check if it's citable, and if it is, do cite it. I know it might increase a lot the list of citations that you add, but that will help us do what we're doing and keep doing it how we're doing it now. One way to add DOIs to your projects that is very easily implemented in GitHub, and it's very straightforward, is, for instance, using tools like Zenodo. Zenodo is an European tool that tracks changes in GitHub repositories and assigns DOIs at every time that a person creates a new release for their projects. Those DOIs are then citable, and Zenodo will tell you how to cite it and will give you many examples on how to cite it and how to work with it. And it's a scientific index, so you can always go on Zenodo and check for some repositories or some data or some code or whatever you want and look for that there. And it's very easy to implement Zenodo in your GitHub repository, but sometimes you might want to add some more information, and that's as easy as adding a small document in JSON format that will tell Zenodo some characteristic of your repository for it to take track of it. For instance, adding affiliations of the authors or adding the org ID. And that's very easy for tracking everything happening also for you. If you are thinking about something a little bit more serious than just adding a DOI to your project, you might think about publishing your project. There are different publication possibilities for you. I'm going to talk now about software, but it's the same case for data and it's the same case for documentation. Now, if you're working on software and you're thinking about publishing it, there are many journals that would accept the publication on software, especially if it's open source software for science. Some of them, if you're working in neuroimaging like me, are, for instance, Frontiers in Neuroinformatics or eLife, and many others. And those journals will have a cost associated to it. They will ask you to do some certain things, for instance, writing a full paper or do some testing for your repository. But if you're looking for something easier and if you don't have so many funds aside for your software publications, there's an alternative. That alternative is called the Journals of Open Source Software, or JOSS for brief. JOSS is a journal online that is perfectly integrated in GitHub and has no cost for publication. And publishing with JOSS means only clicking a button, and then the revision process will actually happen in GitHub itself, where the revisers will ask you to do some changes to your repository in order to improve it before you publish it. Now, once you go public and you publish your repositories, you might attract new people to interact with you and your code or your documentation, your project in general. If that happens, they might even become contributors and add new features or new changes to your code that you might want to track and bring in. Independently from any kind of project, the project can have different types of contributions. For instance, that it might be a contribution just to raise some money to make a publication, or there might be a contribution for do some user testing or checking the grammar of your documentation. It doesn't matter. It's still contributions. So it's important to know how to do them. And it's important to notice that different communities, or even new, might have different requirements or follow different workflows. when they accept contributions. In order to know what they are, it's important to add to your repository a contribution guideline and a code of conduct. Those are two documents that live in your repository that people can check when they want to do changes or track new differences or add new features. And it's basically a list of things that they should respect while they work on stuff. That will make the contribution much easier and much smoother, both for them and for you when you want to review the changes. And it's important to make your contributors know how their contributions will be recognized. Depending on the community and the type of project and maybe the governance scheme of that community or your lab even, contribution might be recognized differently, if recognized at all. But it's important to always explicitly write down how this happens, even if it doesn't happen. For instance, the way that we do it in PhysioPy in this community is using the all contributor specification. The all contributor specification is basically a set list of emojis that you can add various contributors that will tell people what those contributors did. And that basically is a bot that can be interpreted in GitHub very easily, in your repository very easily, and that will create tables like the one that you're seeing now that will link the authors with their pictures so that you know who's working on what, and those emojis that will tell you who did, for instance, coding, who did thinking, who did testing, and other stuff like that. So don't be scared. Think about going public. And if you do that, license your work, assign an identifier, a DOI to it, and then recognize all contributions that might come from it. We've been talking about version control systems. We've been seeing what happens when you go public. I'm going to introduce very quickly automations now. Automations take the form of continuous integration and continuous deployments, or CI/CD workflows, tests, and releases, and other types of events and processes. But we're going to see those three now. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that you might have to do when you go public and you want to maintain a certain standard for your projects. You can do that manually, but that's a lot of work. Or you can set up some workflows. You can set up automations. Those automations become very soon your friends because they will do a bunch of processes for you in the background and you don't even need to think about them anymore. Between those workflows, there's two main concepts that you need to know. One is continuous integration, or CI for short. Continuous integration is the concept of frequently integrating new changes into the main branch of a tool. For instance, by doing automatic testing on new changes every time in order to maintain the stability of your main workflow. Continuous deployment is instead the concept of deploying or releasing as frequently as possible a new version of your project using automated workflows again. So for instance, every time that you add a change, think about releasing a new version for it. And it's very easy to set up such workflows on GitHub and GitLab. They might require a little bit of work at the beginning, just maybe to understand how to do that. But in the end, they will save you a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of energy in the long run, especially if you're thinking about following a project for a very long time. One of those automated workflows that I was talking about is about testing. Testing a project, whether it is code or it is documentation, is very important. It might be as important as developing it, but as a person that makes a lot of mistakes and adds a lot of bugs, unwillingly, obviously, to his code, I can tell you it's even more important because you want to be sure that the nice findings that you found analyzing your data set are actually worth an overprice and are not just a bug that you introduced because you were distracted at a certain point, thinking about coffee instead of coding. So spend time on it. Place them. Do tests on your code. There are multiple types of tests that you can implement. One is user testing, and it's basically when a person, maybe you or a user, uses the tool interfaces with your project and then makes a report about it. Maybe it tells you, oh, this documentation is great, but I will change something in this chapter. Or maybe they tell you, oh, I tried to do this with your code, but it broke down and I don't know why, and let's work it out. That's very helpful, and that should be recognized as a contribution. If you have some time, please do it for other people, because that will help them a lot. But if you don't think that there will be any user for you that will help you doing that, you can also add automated testing. Automated testing is basically when developers write tests by workflow to be run at each change, for them to be sure that what they mean the code to do is happening. The two most frequent type of tests that you will find around are unit tests. That's when you, for instance, test a new piece of code, a new definition on its own, or maybe a new chapter of a documentation on its own, in order to check that they do what they should be doing, or they get compiled correctly. Or maybe the other type of test that you will see around is the integration or end-to-end test, and they are basically tests that check that your project is run as a whole and it does what you're expecting it to do as a whole, even if you integrate new changes to it, without disrupting everything every time. And that, for instance, could be your full code, your full workflow running from head to toe, without making any new strange outcome, or your documentation mounting without any problem, even if you add a new chapter to it. Once you did some testing, the other thing that you want to do, as we discussed before, is doing deployment. Making your project public is important because it will attract users or readers and possibly more contributors. But in order to make it public and easily accessible, you need to basically create frozen version of your project from time to time. That frozen version of your project is a release, and making a release basically means adding a version tag to a certain state of your project, and then literally releasing it to the world, saying how the world can access to it. If your project is based on code, you can even set up CD workflow that will package it for you, and for instance, distribute it in software indexes. For instance, if you're working with Python, you might be familiar with PyPy. This is one of our community projects. It's called Bits. Every time that we make a change, that change is tracked. A new release is created, and that release is automatically published on PyPy. That's something that would take me personally, at the very least, 10 minutes of my time. But in this way, I don't need to think it, and in the mere time of 10 seconds, it's done. And that's something great for you to save some time. And it's not just about code. Once again, it's also for data, but also for documentation. Adina will talk about data a bit more later, but for documentation, to give you an example, you might be familiar with the brain imaging data structure. That is basically a set of rules that you might want to adopt for sharing and organizing your data. And if that's the case, it's good to know that for instance, Bits, the documentation of Bits is actually developed on GitHub, is hosted on GitHub with Git, and from time to time, new versions are released. And those versions are always available for you to be checked at any time, and you might want to go and check when you checked the last time, for instance, to see what were the changes and if anything broke your data set as it is. Now, I talked about different workflows that you can use to do many different things. Where can you find them? It's not actually that difficult to find those workflows. For instance, one thing you can do is checking other repositories, maybe a software that you liked or a documentation that you liked. Check what they do. Normally, those workflows are files in the repository that you can have easy access to. You can check them, copy them, and use them for your own project. But otherwise, both GitHub and GitLab have examples of workflows. In particular, GitHub has a marketplace. That is a place where you can find a lot of different bots, a lot of different apps that will easily integrate in your repository, and that will help you automatize a lot of different tasks, not just the one that we discussed today. And it will also contain a lot of workflows that you can adapt to your project in order to, for instance, test, integrate, and then release and publish. So set up workflows to test, build, and release and publish your project. They will not just help you, they will also increase the stability and the reliability of your outcome. For the moment, this is all that I wanted to talk about today. I would like to thank a couple of groups and a bunch of people. The first group that I would like to thank is the PhysioPy community. This is a community that we founded with some colleague back in 2019. It's a community that expanded over time and grew up quite a little. And this is the community where I actually learned all of the things that I'm discussing today. A little bit because some of these people taught me how to do these things, a little bit because we learned together from case to case how to implement new workflows and new repositories and new tricks with Git. The other group that I would like to thank is my current group at the APFL, the MIP Lab, and especially Dimitri Van Davin, the PI, because they are helping me continue doing software development for science and clinical settings as I work in academia, which is pretty nice for me. And finally, thank you very much for your attention today. If you have any question, I think that you have a little bit of time now, and otherwise we will keep a discussion going at the end of the presentations.
I could start with a very naive question, which I think is hidden behind all the discussion you have when you introduce Git or GitHub to someone which is completely naive, which is it worth it? I mean, suppose that I have, I know of course that it is worth it, but suppose that I just have to collect my 60 participants for my bachelor degree, and then I'll quit this activity or do something else. Is it worth learning this instead of maybe just focusing on the data analysis, writing down a few notes on my lab notebook, and then fly away? Because maybe if it's not like very common practice in the lab, then introducing it just by yourself and so on could be hard.
It's a very good question. And again, I know that starting using Git and GitHub or GitLab in your day-to-day routine might not be easy. It was not easy for me. It was quite hard to start at the beginning. The thing is that after 2 years now, I honestly cannot imagine my routine being different anymore. And honestly, I would panic if somebody told me, oh, you cannot use Git anymore. And that's because, yes, it is worth it. It takes a little bit of time to learn these things. It takes a little bit of time to understand what Git is, how to interface with it very well. But again, it's not just for you to leave something to other people. For instance, if you stop working in a lab and you change lab and you want your colleagues to be able to access to what you've been doing when and to see what has been done in order to avoid, for instance, repeating the same thing that you've been doing in previous times or avoiding mistakes that you've been doing. It's also for yourself. I cannot speak to the person that started developing the tools that I started developing 2 years ago, because that person is me and I honestly forgot what I did. But if I had this system to keep track of my changes, to comment what I did, then it's easy for me to understand why I did what I did. Back then, 2 years ago, when I started using Git, I was not very good at writing comments for my commits, writing messages and describing what I was doing. And that doesn't make it easy. But it's still easier than just thinking, oh, wait, did I try that other option for my preprocessing? Or did I try that other analysis that then didn't work out or not? It might happen sometimes when you talk to your PIs that they ask you, have you done that analysis? And then the next time you bring that analysis instead of the first one that you did, and they will ask, oh, did you do that analysis that you perfectly know that you did the first time, but they forgot about? And with Git, it's very easy to show them, yes, I did it. It's here. Look at it. And those were the results, by the way. And that's all tracked, and that's easy to access. And once you move to GitHub, as I described before, you have a lot of other perks that comes with Git. For instance, seriously, the type of testing that you're doing. it happens a lot of time that what we publish contains mistakes. We are illuding ourselves that science is objective. It's not, and it's not because people make science and people make mistakes. So science becomes subjective as soon as a person introduces a little bug to a code. Knowing that what you're doing is what you mean to do is very important. So for instance, just trying that a full workflow, even if it's just an analysis or a preprocessing, work on a single piece of data from head to bottom helps you knowing that if you set up the same test for every other thing to act similarly to that first case, what you're expecting to happen will be what is happening. And maybe nothing will change just because, I don't know, like you just forget about setting up a flag and a parameter in your analysis or something like that. So those are good perks for it. And once you go public, you get collaborators, you get cited, you get people interested in your work. That's, for instance, how I created a community with my colleagues. That's, for instance, how I was contacted by a bunch of people that were asking me to share my code with them. And I was telling them, oh, it's actually there, take it. And some other people saying, oh, this is great work, but I would like to add this other thing. Can I do that? I did myself that a couple of times in which I collaborated with other colleagues because I thought that their work was amazing, but maybe I wanted to add that little thing and I did. And they gained from it and I gained from it. And that's all because of version control system and the whole environment that was created from them. So yes, sorry for the long answer, but it's worth it, even if it's costing you a little bit of time more.
Thanks. I think it's all these points that you raised are really relevant in that, yes, it can be, let's say, even if it's not that hard, it can be tricky to sit there and commit to this specific approach. But then if you try to think about, let's focus on scientific programming itself. And I think I already mentioned the importance of tests, especially throughout the presentation. You pointed out that unit tests and so on and so forth. I think that the effort you could spend in trying to fine-tune that phase, for example, with unit tests, validating your data, validating your code, and so on, would save you, let's say, potentially complicated situation at the end of your whole analysis. My other comment would be whether you suggest, let's say, versioning everything approach or just keep it to the analysis. I'm thinking about, for example, the preparation of stimulation phase. Do you think, or do you know whether people are versioning also code for presenting stimuli, or people are focusing specifically on data analysis and so on?
It depends a lot on the lab. It depends a lot of the experience of people and researchers. Honestly, I am a person that goes public as soon as starts the first commit. That's why I insisted so much on the licensing as well, because it's an important step of the process. I like to just put out what I'm doing the whole time. That's a little bit for me to have a bit more pressure in not doing mistakes. But that's also because worst case scenario, somebody will catch those mistakes before I do. And that helps me when I do coding. So I try to commit everything that I do for an experiment, even the things that come before data collection. I've seen some repositories that are specifically about, for instance, stimuli presentation. I could make a couple of examples if you want of a couple of colleagues that put their whole PsychoPy code on GitHub for other people to access to it, and they used it to track the changes to their stimuli. I personally didn't do it, but mainly because the last time that I acquired data was more than 2 years ago when I started using it. if I'm going to do it again, I'm going to do it for sure. It's not so common to see it, though, honestly. It's most of the time you see code that was published because papers ask you to make your analysis public. And that's a little bit of a pity because you're losing the whole workflow track and everything. So it's always good to start from the beginning instead.
So feel free if you want to ask other questions to Stefano. Yeah, so let's go back here at 4 o'clock, and we'll start with introducing Adina to the audience, and then the second talk for the day. Thanks. So after this very interesting presentation by Stefano Moia, we'll switch to the second contribution by Adina Wagner. Adina is a research associate at the Research Center Jülich and a doctoral researcher at the Heinrich Heine University Düsseldorf in Germany. She's a software developer for the Data Lab project, a data management tool built up on Git and Gitanex, and a proponent of open science, open source, and reproducible research. Apart from coffee, she runs on Cusswords, Scotch, and XKCD comics. Adina, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Adina. I'm from the Research Center Jülich in Germany, and I do a PhD in neuroscience, but I'm also a software developer for the Data Lab project and teach data and reproducibility management. And I'm really happy to be here, so many thanks for inviting me and organizing this. I even got to wear a themed t-shirt for the occasion, which is, it sparks joy for my inner nerd. So thanks a lot. What I want to talk about today is a talk where I hope to show you how you can extend all of these advantages that version control with Git and Git repository hosting services such as GitHub to data and other files. And if you want to read up on anything that I'm touching in my talk, then you can also find my slides online. They are on GitHub, and if you can scan the QR code, then you can get a PDF of them as well. This comic here is my go-to example when I motivate version control. You already saw it in Stefano's slides. It's the chaos that can easily ensue when someone does not use version control tools, but has a very complex project that builds up over time. But I specialize also in research data management, and I can assure you that you can also have these kinds of folders for research data, just that they don't contain scripts with slightly different file names, but they are filled with gigabytes or even terabytes of data with almost identical file names. For example, this is a real-life example here where someone has slightly different copies of one and the same data set on a compute cluster, and this quite substantial directory takes up about 13 terabytes of data. Now, what you've heard about Git might make it seem like Git can help with this problem. After all, there are just slightly different copies of the same thing, and you can clear that up by putting everything into version control, right? The problem is that Git is not handling large files really well. It is a tool that originated in software development, and that's a field that's characterized by very small and text-based files. What Git does in very simple terms is whenever you commit something, it creates a snapshot of all of the files in your repository. And when your files change between snapshots, then your repository size grows a little bit as well because it creates a new snapshot of that file. With small files or text-based files, this growth is completely negligible, both because text files are super small, but also because Git has very efficient strategies to store those files. But when you put large files into Git, for example, you acquire brain data and then you put your nifties into your Git repository, then those snapshots suddenly become quite large and your repository grows much more. Also, depending on what type of file it is, it may not have any efficient strategy to internally store that kind of file particularly well. And these increases in repository size then manifest in performance loss then manifest in performance loss. So for example, when you clone a repository from GitHub, then you need to retrieve the complete repository, including all of the past snapshots in order to have the complete revision history. But the more large files you have, the slower this becomes, simply because there's so much more data to retrieve. Now, Git really doesn't have a file size. You can version control all kinds of large files, just like it's slower over time and you need to have a lot of patience. However, most repository hosting services have file size limits. So GitHub, for example, will not let you push a file that exceeds the size of 100 megabytes. And if you have ever accidentally committed a large file into your Git repository, then you may know how much of a hassle it is to get a file out of revision control. This is not a particularly simple task. So using Git for version control, using Git for version controlling large files is not really something that is advisable, and I would actually advise against it. So what I want to talk about today is distributed version control that is based on Git, but for files that you typically can't version control with Git because they are, for example, too large. And I want to talk about two open source tools in particular that make this possible. The first one is Git-Annex, and the second one is DataLad. My goal is to show you the general advantages of version control for data, both by showing you some real-life examples, but then also showing you some of the technical details, how things work, and how you can yourself make use of these two tools for your day-to-day research. Just as a disclaimer, I know much more about DataLad because I'm a developer for this tool, so you will see me using more DataLad examples. But the two tools actually build up on each other, and DataLad's functionality and DataLad's command simply build up on Git-Annex commands underneath. So let me start with the basics of Git-Annex, because this is the fundamental tool here. Git-Annex is a really powerful file synchronization system. It builds up on Git and it integrates very smoothly into your Git repository, which is an advantage because now that you know all of the Git workflow, there's nothing really new that you need to learn conceptually. You just can extend your Git repository also with large data now. What Git-Annex allows you to do is to version control large files with Git, but not to store the content of those large files in your repository snapshots. So let me give you a basic idea how this works. This here is your Git repository, and what Git-Annex does is it secretly adds a location where it manages files and information where copies of those files exist. And this location is called the annex. So you have a Git repository that looks completely normal, just a normal directory on your file system, but it has two pieces, a Git repo and an annex. And whenever you give a file to Git-Annex, Git doesn't get to see the file contents, but Git-Annex calculates what is called a hash of this file, and this hash encodes the file content, the file identity. And this hash is super tiny, just a character string. Git-Annex then places the file contents in the annex where Git-Annex manages them. And your Git repository can then stay very small, and it can be hosted on your favorite Git repository hosting service, while Git-Annex allows you to distribute your data in a distributed network of all kinds of other infrastructure or third-party hosting services. Importantly, this mechanism does not require a specific kind of service. You can use almost any infrastructure or third-party service, and you may already use those actually. And internally, what Git-Annex then does is it associates the locations of your files and its copies with your Git repository so that it can retrieve the file contents on demand. But I will show you that in an example shortly. Just really want to stress how amazing Git-Annex is. To highlight the maintainer here, credit where credit is due. It's maintained by Joey Hess, and he's quite a legendary software developer. Chances are really high that you're currently using a system which runs successfully because of a tool he wrote 20 years ago. It's a very impressive piece of software. Now, the other tool is DataLab, and this is co-developed with GitAnnex. And it initially originated from the leads of the NeuroDebian project, which packages neuroscientific software. And neuroscientific software, sadly, does not only include code, but it also includes large files, for example, brain atlases. And when distributing such software packages with large files, you quickly begin to wonder how you can distribute those files. So initially, the creators of NeuroDebian, Jarek and Michael here, they started the DataLab project to create a data distribution tool that made data distribution easy. And they based this tool on Git and GitAnnex, but over the course of the development of the tool, the focus shifted a bit to a data management and data publication tool. And therefore, DataLab is tuned to a lot of scientific use cases. And one of its particular aims is also to make version control workflows where you would usually git add, commit, push, pull, and so forth, a little bit easier and easier to start. Also because researchers don't have a technical background in many cases or the necessary training. So in the Symposium, after all, you'll learn about 3 version control tools. And Git is at the basis of all of them. GitAnnex builds up on Git, and then DataLab builds up on both of them. And over the course of the talk, I'll demonstrate what the advantages are that DataLab also has in terms of scientific workflows on top of Git and GitAnnex. If you later want to read up on these tools, then you can check out a number of resources. What I specifically want to draw your attention to is the DataLab Handbook, which is a community resource with tutorials that I maintain. And it's basically a complete book filled with tutorials for research data management. And because that's quite a difficult topic, the book is tuned for people with any kind of background, specifically people without a technical background, and tries to make data management and version control workflows very easy to adhere to and explain them also to people who haven't used any version control tools yet. Now, to get started with the version control tools, let me answer the basic question of how can I get something, any structure where I can version control data in. So to start version controlling your data, depending on which tool you use, there's a slightly different terminology and also slightly different processing. If you were to use purely GitAnnex, then you would start with a Git repository where you would just initialize this. And inside of that Git repository, you initialize an NX repo. What you call that then is a so-called NX repo, but it's a Git repository with an NX. If you use DataLab, then you create what is called a DataLab dataset, either in a new directory or in a pre-existing directory. And internally, that will actually also create a Git repository and an NX repo. So whenever I say DataLab dataset, then it is also a Git repo, also an NX repo. And when you have a dataset, then you can use DataLab commands. I will show you a few in my talk, but you can also use any kind of Git or GitAnnex command that you want. Now, once you have a place to version control your files, you can reap the advantages that version control has also for your data. And I want to show you the functionality of those tools by going through all of Git's advantages and outline how they extend to data and to science in general. And the first one here is transparency. So without version control, you easily create piles of files that are almost identical. And it's hard to find the right file or the most recent file and so forth. What you do with version control is to create order and structure. You can query the revision history inside of your dataset about the file contents of past versions and so forth. So for example, here is a terminal view. I'm really sorry for the terminal view, but let me assure you that also terminals can be nice. Like you can make them look pretty if you want to. They don't need to be super intimidating. So what you can see in this terminal is a Git revision history of a recent paper that I wrote. And what you can see in this revision history that the changes that we made to the manuscript over time, they are annotated with information on when, by whom, how, why a change was made. And I can get detailed information on each change, and I can interact with the history to fix past mistakes or go back and forth in time and so forth. This level of transparency is incredibly useful for data too, because just like code or manuscripts evolve over time, data changes as well. So, for example, one reason may be that you acquire additional data and you extend your data set. Maybe you identify an error in one of the files and fix it, or the bit standard changes and you restructure your data set to the most current one. If you are in neuroscience, then you may also work with the ABCD data resource. And then you probably know this tweet from 2019, which was a time when it was identified that some MRI scanners in the dataset produced faulty files due to a flipped field map direction. And researchers that had used the specific data release needed to exclude the affected files and rerun their analysis, because naturally, when the data changes, the chances are high that the results also change too. But we can only detect these kinds of things. We can only be sure which data was used for an analysis if we have the same kind of transparency that Git allows us to have for code or for text files. Here's a real-life example of how this looks like in an Annex repo or a dataset. You can see here that this first commit, where the arrow points at, fixed a script that performed the conversion of a physiological file. And then this next commit, that is a commit that includes changed data. This commit reconverted all of the data with the fixed script and thus updated data that was previously faulty. So when you use this data, or dataset or repo, then you can transparently see what has been done to it, and you can be sure that you actually use the fixed version of the data. So how do you do data version control in practice with those tools? How do you version control data? In a pure Git Annex workflow, in the basic case, you would go into your Git repository or Annex repository, add a file into it, and then you would call git annex add and then commit your changes. So the workflow is very similar to Git, and it supports all of the cool things that Git lets you do. For example, branching, pushing, updating, and so forth. In a data-led dataset, the command looks slightly different. It's simplified and is a single data-led save. And this command internally puts the file either into Git or into Git Annex, depending on how you configured it. So, for example, you can configure a dataset to put all text files into Git, and then all other files into the Annex, and whatever the modification, a data-led save then will just do the right thing and build up your revision history with both of these two tools. Now, importantly, the looks and feels of your repo or dataset barely change when you annex a file. Your data stays what it is. It doesn't get transformed into any weird kind of data structure. And here's what a directory looks like that is filled with version control data. Barely any change to how it would usually look like. We have to dig really deep to actually see the difference in a file that is version controlled with Git Annex. And here is how that looks like if you take a very close look in your terminal. What you can see here is that the annexed file, even though it looks like it's there in the directory that you put it in, it is secretly stored in the Annex. So you have this path here that points to the secret location inside of your dataset. And Git only gets to track this character string at the end of the path, which contains this cryptic sequence of characters, and that's a hash that encodes this file's identity and content. And this hash is super, super tiny, so Git only tracks a tiny pointer, and your repository is just looks just like a normal directory, and you can work with it as if it would be, but everything is version controlled. So doing this thing, just adding large files, saving them or committing them, immediately gives you the advantage of complete transparency in the evolution of your dataset. The next advantage is accessibility. I bet you know this feeling when you find a paper that describes a tool that you would really urgently need for your next research project, but then the text says you need to email the corresponding author to get a copy of the toolbox. But then you do that, and one author left academia and now teaches yoga classes, and the other author does not have this email anymore because he had to change institution twice, and the email is simply expired. Oops. So that's a bummer. It's something entirely different if you find a paper that says, hey, the code for my analysis or my toolbox can be found on GitHub, and then there's a link to GitHub, and it's a public GitHub page that you can access. So that's just an amazing feeling in comparison. Because what this does, both for you as a consumer, but also for you as a producer of useful code or other resources, is it removes the bottleneck of this single email address. It's much easier to find. GitHub has nice search functions, or GitLab, all kinds of hosting services have. And thus it's also easier to reuse. And the work that you created can also make a larger impact if you just put it on GitHub and make it easy for the world to discover and take. Obviously, use a license, as Stefano has said. Now, when you use version control tools to version your data, then you can also increase the accessibility of your data in a similar way. So here's a repository on GitHub that contains data from the Study Forest project with MRI data acquired during naturalistic stimulation. And just like a normal Git repository, I can clone this repository from GitHub. You can see that cloning is fast because the large files are annexed and upload the repository. And then what I can do here is I can selectively retrieve the annexed contents from the remote sources on up to per file level. So here, for example, I'm retrieving the file contents of all of the data from a localization tasks of one subject. And this is a very, very convenient way to access data that version control tools for data make possible. The simplest way to have this kind of accessibility for data for you as a consumer is to clone a repository or a dataset, for example, from GitHub. And then either with a git annex call or with a dataset call, you get the files or directories that you want. The fortunate side effect of this is that a fresh clone of these kinds of repositories is super small in size, regardless of how much data it tracks. You can still browse the existing files because Git has this tiny pointer, and then a get call retrieves the content as you need them, regardless of where the data actually lives, as soon as you need them. So, for example, my own computer has 500 gigabytes of disk space, but I have many datasets on my computer, and they give me actionable direct access to about 0.5 petabyte of research data just at the tip of my hands. And what's nice is that all of this access is streamlined. So it requires just a get call, regardless of whether the data is on a cluster, in an S3 bucket, in a Dropbox account, anything. I'll introduce the next advantage with this absolute nightmare of all graduate students. This is a note left by a 5th-year PhD candidate about their stolen laptop. And in this note, they offer to buy back a single directory from that computer that contains the only copy of their thesis defense for $1,000 from the person who stole their laptop. So that's quite a nightmare there. But you can prevent this kind of situation by keeping and synchronizing backups of your data. And Git is great for this because of its distributed nature. You can use other infrastructure like your institute's cluster, or you can use hosting services like GitHub, GitLab, and then you can push your changes and keep all of the clones of your project synchronized all the time. So when your laptop dies, you can just get a new laptop, clone this repository, and start right where you left it off. With decentral version control tools for data, you can do the same thing, but with the data that is annexed, creating a kind of security layer or backup layer. Decentral version control basically distributes your data to other infrastructure or third-party services, but keeps track where everything is. And you can thus create backups and alternative data sources if one data source falls. If you compare this to a centralized system where only one place stores all of the data at all times, a decentralized system is much more resilient, because when the central provider dies, access to the data is blocked or lost immediately. And in a decentralized system, other data sources may still have other copies of those files and then provide you with the data that you need. With GitAnnex and DataLed, you typically let your data be transferred to a third-party provider, a data hosting service, because the Git repository hosting service, they usually don't allow you to host Annex data. And then the transport layer of this dataset or Annex repository registers the source where your data exists and where it can be retrieved from. And when someone accesses the Git repository from the hosting service, then it automatically knows where to retrieve the data from and gets them, for example, from the cloud. Here's a quick example how this kind of transport and logistics layer looks like. So this is a dataset from OpenNeuro, and OpenNeuro actually uses DataLed as a backend. So all of the data that is hosted on OpenNeuro can be retrieved as DataLed datasets, such as this one here. Let's clone this dataset and then retrieve some data from it in order to see the remote locations of availability for those files. So if I go into this directory and then get a single file, so for example, in this case, I'm getting a T1 weighted MRI image, and then it will be retrieved in a streamlined way from the remote source. In this case, it's in a S3 bucket, but I actually don't need to know, and I don't need to care. But I can query the file where it actually comes from and where else it is available. So you can see if I run this command here, git-annex where is, that there are a number of sources that have this file. One is this local computer because I just retrieved it. The other one is a public S3 bucket that is available under this URL right here. And because there are other sources available for this file, I can drop the file content so I don't have it locally anymore. And the version control tools, they register this. And if I run the same command again, you can see that here is not listed as a source anymore. Other than solutions where you need to split the hosting of the Git and the Annex part, there are also some really handy services where Git and Annex hosting is combined. And I want to mention them because they are so useful for science and for data sharing. The one I want to highlight here today is Gin. Gin is a German Git repository hosting service. And this service is one of the few Git repository hosting services that includes support for the Annex. And here is how you can make use of this. Let's say you have a data set right here. Then you can automatically publish it to a Gin account. And here I'm using a DataLed convenience command to do this. DataLed creates a blank Gin. And what this does is it creates a copy of your repository on the repository hosting service. And then I can push both my Git repository as well as the data that it tracks into the Gin repository. And then once this is done, my data exists in two places. Here I can now query it, and you can see that it is locally available and remotely available. So now that there's a different place, I can drop it locally. And save disk space, but I can get it again from Gin on demand whenever I need it. And that's quite handy. The next advantage is services. The next advantage is how services increase the reusability of your work. And Stefano has already shown you great examples of this. And I actually don't have a different example. I'm using the same one. So let's say I have written a small bit of code. This was for my master's thesis, and I published it to GitHub in order to, help the world, share it, get improvements from the community, and so forth. But what I can do now that this is on GitHub, I can register for an account on Zenodo, link my GitHub account, and then with very minimal work, link this Git repository and the release of any kind of version of my code to Zenodo, so that Zenodo creates a software archival for me. And then it assigns my work a persistent identifier in the form of a DOI. And it makes my work citable. Also attaches a lot of metadata to it, which is all really, really cool and nice. But the cool thing is, or the even cooler thing is, that there are similar services for versioned data. And Gin is another great example of this. So here is a dataset that was published as a supplement to a open access publication. And what you can see here too is that this DOI right up here that has been assigned to this dataset by the Gin team. And the archival process that you do with Gin is also very minimal in work. You just need to add a file with some metadata. So Gin ensures that you have some minimal metadata attached to your data, and then it assigns a DOI to it. It also makes sure that there's a license. You can see that it's a whooping 128 gigabytes that were archived here. So it's a great service that this repository hosting service provides here. And if you're interested in how to publish data to Gin yourself, then you can go to the Data-led handbook, and then you can find a complete walkthrough on how this can be done if you have data that you need to publish openly for your next publication. I can definitely recommend it. The next advantage is collaboration. And Stefano already showed you how much science can benefit from those collaborative workflows that get introduced for text files for code development. The cool thing is that this principle works just the same for repositories with NX data. You have the very same interface with GitHub, and you can also do all kinds of collaborative routines that involve, let's say, your data analysis. So what you can see here, for example, is the largest data-led dataset that I currently maintain. This is a public dataset that allows you to retrieve data from the Human Connect project if you have access. And you can see here that there were quite a number of pull requests that updated this repository over the course of time. So even though this is a repository that contains purely data, you can still use GitHub to do pull requests and collaborate with others or do collaborative work. And what this process in general allows is to strengthen this team science aspect that Stefano mentioned, because it makes collaboration also easier on data. You can collaborate on data analysis as if you were developing code, or as if you are collaboratively writing a paper. And here's another example, an old issue of mine where I had used an open dataset, but I had found a different reference in the literature that reported a mistake that was made in this dataset, and I checked, and the mistake in the data wasn't fixed. So what I did is I contacted the authors of this dataset by making an issue on their GitHub repository. And then I PR'd a fix that updated the data. So you can not only have this kind of transparent revision history of data, but you can also work on them as collaboratively as you do on code. And that is a great contribution to the workflows that we typically deal with in science, because data is at the basis of what we often do. Now, this leads over quite nicely to the next advantage, and that is efficiency. Now, repository hosting services, and GitHub is at the forefront of this, they add many features for organizing, for interaction, for collaboration, and they also integrate with all of these cool services that Stefano mentioned, for example, documentation building, documentation hosting, continuous integration workflows, GitHub Actions, and so forth. And because they do this on Git repositories, anything that you put version data into can benefit from this as well, as long as you put it on GitHub. So that's quite nice. But a common fear when you not only use Git repository, when you use Git version controlled, but then also think about version control for data. So extending your tool stack is that it could be a little bit too much. Like it can reduce. It's a common fear that it can reduce your efficiency because you have to learn all of these new tools and all of these new workflows. And as the question session, the short one, already showed, there is certainly a point to it. It's not easy to learn these kinds of tools, but I would say it's definitely worth it. But when we talk about version control tools for data, what I often hear from people is that, well, they already have one or the other way to share their data, because we need to share data in our day-to-day work, and all of us typically have a way that works for them. So you might email Dropbox links around, or Google Drives, or you may share your data with the OSF. But Git Annex already supports a wide variety of those third-party services. And then when you use DataLad, then you're using a tool that is built to maximize interoperability with them, so that the tools that you already use are basically the tools that you can keep on using with minimal changes for your own work. So let's say you use the Open CIMeC framework to share your data. Then you can install an additional Python package for DataLad and extension, and that lets you automatically publish your data to the Open CIMeC framework. So here's a data set again, and you can create a sibling on the Open CIMeC framework. And then what this convenience command does, it under your user account on the OSF creates a new project. And then you can push all of your changes, your Git repository part, and your annexed data contents to the OSF to let them to share them with your collaborators, and then that's it. So that's quite neat, and it doesn't reduce your efficiency, but rather helps you with efficiency in the long run. Now, the last advantage is particularly important for science and for Open CIMeC, and that one is reproducibility. I think everyone is aware that science has different building blocks. So just like ingredients in a recipe, you have code, you have software, you have data, each in their precise version, and then you mix them together, and then they produce the research outputs that you describe in your paper, just like following a recipe. Now, the more of these ingredients you share, the more likely is it that someone or your future self can take all of those individual pieces and reproduce your findings. But where version control tools help is to keep all of these ingredients also next to each other. Your code, your data, your software, everything can be version controlled alongside each other and then found in a single place. So here is an example, and I'm just going to let this run. I don't have time enough to talk about the details here. But here is an example of how this kind of abstract concept of version controlling everything together can make reproducibility quite easy. Because what this is reproducible work in the form of a reproducible paper that is shared on GitHub. And this GitHub repository here that belongs to this publication that has been published last year, it contains the relevant code, it contains the relevant software, and it contains the relevant data all in one place. And once I have this, I can then do a little bit of automation with the tools that I'm familiar with or that I like. I also don't need this, but it's easy to do once you have this framework where you can already version control everything alongside each other. And what you can see here in this recording is that you can create a reproducible paper where a single or very few commands allow you to retrieve every ingredient of your scientific research. And then in this case here, this paper recomputes itself. So it recalculates all of the results. It obtains all of the data wherever this data lives. And then it embeds everything back into the manuscript and gives you a PDF. And if you're interested in finding out about this, then you can read this write-up down here. It includes a tutorial. But just to show you one of the pieces that make it work is that you can embed the functionality of the version control tools, for example, in your code. So in this concrete example, we just included a data.get call inside of the scripts that we used. And those get calls retrieved the data at exactly the point in time where the code needed it so that it could run and compute or recompute the results. Now, in my final slides, I want to highlight a few unique advantages that data version control tools bring to science that go beyond the advantages that Git on its own already has. And the first one is modularity. And this is a feature that Datalet adds to Git and Git Annex. When you think about science, it is quite a modular and consecutive process. So you start with raw data, and then you pre-process your data. And then based on this pre-processed data, you perform a couple of analyses, and then you package your analysis up and report the results in a paper. And the previous steps of each of these things, they are a little bit like inputs or dependencies. So your paper depends on your analysis depends on the pre-processed data, your pre-processed data depends on the raw data, and so forth. And then there are also parts where more than one type of usage is possible. So your pre-processed data can serve as an input or as a dependency for multiple analysis. So typically, it's quite cumbersome to add Git repositories to each other. There's a mechanism to this, but it's quite a pain in the ass. What Datalet allows you to do is to link datasets inside of each other and then work across a long hierarchy of datasets in a recursive manner, and that makes it feel as if this hierarchy of datasets are actually just a single repository. What this does is it modularizes those research components. And this has unique advantages. You have a much more transparent process because every single module is identifiable. You have increased reusability because each of those individual modules can be cloned on its own to be used in the next project, like the pre-processed data. And you have improvements for access management because each of those individual repositories can be kept private or public, depending on what type of contents it has. So that's nice. And because those data sets are so small when you don't retrieve any data, what this also allows you to do is you can have your data analysis and you can link a very lightweight dependency link to the data that your analysis used at basically no extra disk space costs. So you have this transparency of, hey, which version of the data have I used in this analysis, without the need to actually store the data right next to your analysis. What this also helps with is scaling. One shortcoming of Git repositories of Git is that once you place more than, let's say, 500,000 files in them, they begin to struggle. Everything becomes kind of sluggish. But some datasets, for example, easily have more files than 500,000. But once that happens, if you have this kind of nesting mechanism, this modularity and linkage, then you can split your large datasets into individually smaller datasets and link them together. And this overcomes scaling issues and allows you to version control arbitrarily sizes of data. So, for example, we do this for the Human Connectome project. It used to be 80 terabytes, but after the November update, I think it's about 200 or so, 200 terabytes, and dozens of millions of files. And we also do it for the UK Biobank dataset, all with individual sub-datasets. And this is how we can scale these tools to work with these large datasets. And in the end, this modularity or this nesting can make your complete research pipeline transparent and reusable. So when a data dependency down the line, your raw data and your preprocessed data changes, then you can update the complete pipeline or inspect the changes transparently and also update all of the modules that rely on it. So that's a great advantage, particularly for scientific workflows. The next advantage is privacy. When you're in neuroscience as well, then you have some data in your acquisitions that is sensitive and really can't be shared. For example, participant information or unanonymized raw data. But Stefano already mentioned it. Whatever you version control with Git is stored forever in the version history of your repository, unless you really make a lot of work to get it out of there. So imagine you accidentally write your password into a file and then commit it. Even if you remove the file in the next commit, anyone who obtains the repository can go back in time and then find your password. But when you annex a file, the file content is not stored in the revision history. What's stored is only a hash from which you cannot infer any of the contents. And if any file or collection of files it needs to remain private, you can either configure these files to not be published, or you can publish them to places to which only some or authorized people have access to. So even though people can then clone your repository, they will not be able to retrieve the private files, or they need to input a password and can't find sensitive contents in the revision history. And the last aspect is provenance capture. Exact information of how a file came to be. I hurry up because I'm running out of time. This is the last advantage, I promise you. And provenance information is important because even when you share code in software and data, the process from how you get from your raw data to your result is quite multi-stepped and complex. So after a bit of time, you will look at your project directory and you will wonder, oh God, which script has produced this file? And you might not remember. So what we do is we need to enshrine this typically labor-intensive manual process of data analysis into something that's machine readable and ideally re-executable, so that it's not only documented how a result came to be, but that also a computer can redo the computation automatically. And DataLet has a number of commands that can create records that attach provenance information on the process that produced the input data that was necessary, the command that was run, and so forth, to any specific output file. And those records are machine readable and then automatically re-executable as well. And here's a really quick example. What is illustrated here is a so-called DataLet containers run call. This runs a computational pipeline in a software container on one subject's data. And the results of those computations, they are saved automatically with a commit message and annexed. And in the commit message, there also is an additional structured record. This is a so-called run record, and this run record includes information on the input data, on the software container, on the command that was used, and so forth. And what I can then do is to use the commit hash, so this character string that identifies each specific revision, and give it to a rerun command. And then this structured record in the commit message is used to retrieve the relevant data, the relevant software, re-execute the precise command, and recompute the result exactly as it has been produced. And this also works on the largest scale. If you're interested in how you can use this or how we have used it, then you can actually read a paper that just came out today where we used a reproducible processing framework that you can also just use by using a bootstrapping script that we share if you click on this link right here. So my take-home message after all of these advantages are that data deserves version control because it changes similarly to how code evolves. When you use version control tools like Github and DataLab, then you can extend the advantages that version control for data for small files has also to data. But beyond this, there are also additional benefits that you can reap for science when you use those two tools. So you can have access to more data than you have disk space. You can have run records that help you and not rely on your short-term memory anymore. And you can link data dependencies to the analysis that you run and share. And with that, I want to thank all of the creators, maintainers, collaborators, contributors, funders of the software projects. I also want to thank the Turing Way for amazing illustrations that I used. And I want to thank you for your attention. And I hope that I was able to motivate you to version control your data. And that's it.
Thanks, Adina. It was a sort of like tour, like a very rich landscape of all the potential uses of data version control. I really like the sentence "data deserves control." I think it was one of the most powerful messages you sent with this talk. Feel free to ask questions by.
Just one, actually, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just learned that I can process HCP data one by one without having to download full terabytes of that disk. It's great. So that was fantastic. Thank you for pointing that out. Quick question: does that allow interaction with private repositories?
Yes, and I think it's actually the default. So, I mean, there are different ways to do this. You can do it just as you would do it with Git. You can create a Git repository in the web interface, and then you get your URL, SSH or HTTPS that you can add as a remote. You can also, if you use DataLab, and like I don't want to convert people to using DataLab, you can also get this with Git Annex alone. But you can do DataLab create sibling GitHub, and that will, if you have your GitHub account linked, so if you have any kind of means of authentication, like an OAuth token in your Git config, then DataLab will go and create a repository on GitHub for you. And by default, unless you do like, please make it public, like we have a -- public flag, this repository will be private so that you don't accidentally leak anything into the public void. And then if you, like I frequently do it accidentally, because I forget to put in the public flag, and then I go to the repository web interface and just like, yes, please make this repository public. I do want this.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, and also thank you for your talk. I haven't gotten the chance yet, but it was a really nice overview, also extending to much more than version control, but spanning all kinds of really useful practices.
So we have a question from Emilio Sartelli. I don't know if do you want to ask a question yourself? Emilio? Okay. So the question is, thanks for the good talk. I'm wondering, how does data-led scale compare to relational databases?
That's a tough question, and I'm afraid I'm also not the expert that you may need to answer this, because I don't know about relational databases and how good they scale. I just know that data-led definitely isn't a database, but doesn't have issues with scalability as far as we know. So I can give you some intuition on the scale of things that I'm aware of from projects that currently use data-led, and then maybe if you have more experience with relational databases, you can at least gauge how that would compare. So one of the largest data sets that we version control is, for example, the Human Connectome project, or the UK Biobank project. And the UK Biobank project, for example, is a data resource that will eventually contain imaging data for 100,000 participants. 100,000 participants is already quite challenging, because on some operating systems or file systems, you can't keep that many directories on a single level. But with the current amount of data, so several hundred petabytes, several dozens of million of files, as long as you nest the data in sufficiently small data sets, so data sets that are smaller than 500,000 files, there is nothing that prevents scaling at all. There's also no real limit in terms of file sizes, and that's because GitAnnex is so incredibly good at managing large data. We have other neuroscientists in the institution that I work that acquire medical data in the form of histological slices of brains, and they do really high resolution scans on them. So a single file, a single slice, a single scan that they have is in the size of terabytes, literal terabytes. So they have enormously large data, and they currently version control 0.5 petabyte of data with data-led. And this is the largest amount, or those are the largest file sizes that I'm aware of. And I can't guarantee that we will not reach sizes where we will start to see struggles. But those are the current highest scalability things that I'm aware of. And we'll try to obviously keep the tool in shape and let it grow with the challenges it faces. So because all of us are scientists, data-led is a community developed tool, just like Stefano's tool. We use it in our day-to-day work and for our research data management use cases, and also for large consortia, because it makes data integrations quite easy. You can keep all kinds of different files in a data set. It doesn't need to be the same type of file. It can be basically everything that you need to have together. And based on our experiences, we developed the tools. We developed the tool to scale to what is currently the largest needed use case. And so that was not the most helpful answer that would be possible. Sorry for not knowing more about relational databases, but I hope it was able to give you at least some idea of the current largest scale of the use cases we support. And thanks for the question.
Thanks really for this question. I think it also raises a point which is often not so discussed in, say, common neuroscience environment and so on, scalability and how good something could perform when you have to deal with many data or data which are that big. So thanks for this point. Other questions? I think we are both in. It's 5 o'clock, so we are seamlessly switching from, let's say, Adina dedicated question and answer to discussion panel. So feel free to ask questions on Adina's talk or questions from general interest related to what we discussed today. I would just comment on the fact that I want to thank Adina for that thorough and rich explanation of GeneGenome, because CIMeC itself has an experimental page on GeneGenome. There's an external repository for sharing the data to the community, to public community. So let's put it this way. I think the gene it has several let's say several details, let's say, which make cognitive neuroscientists data sharing for cognitive neuroscientists easier and more effective with respect to other repositories. For example, the fact that you can earn a DOI, the fact that you can describe your data set in the front page. You can also download a single file at a time. But I think for the purposes of this event, I think another interesting part of this story is that it's also a trigger for disseminating the data version control to people. It's not. I think it's as you pointed out, it's the only repository which is based on GitHub, isn't it?
It's not strictly the only one. So there's a great amount of open source Git repository hosting services. Like GitLab is one of the major ones that probably many people know, also because there's a big company behind it and there's a big public instance. But as Stefano already mentioned, like GitLab, for example, can also be deployed for your own institution. You can tell your IT personnel to set one instance up for you. And what GitLab also had, and it's disabled for most of them, but you should be able to enable it if you have administrative rights, is annex support. But because this is quite a struggle for IT personnel and for institutional resources, simply because it adds the enormous amount that data sharing, like these large files, put on the institutional resources for that, it's often disabled. And I haven't yet found a GitLab instance where that's possible. I only know that from the documentation of the tool. And then Gin is, as far as I know, a clone of a tool called Gox. So Gox is the open source part that enables creating these kinds of repositories, and Gox also has an annex support if you enable it, and that's why Gin can have it. But as you said, it's the only one. It's the only public one where I'm actually aware of that you can also host your annex data, and I'm incredibly grateful for this kind of service, and also because it's European service. With some data managers and some data protection officers, this is a really good argument when you urgently need to share your data, make your data public, because it's not an Amazon S3 bucket that lives on the east coast of the US and is subject to different data protection laws.
So while we wait for questions, I would try to ask you whether you think that these could be, let's say, the version control as part of the everyday research routine is not like, it's not even like a small part. This could be like the backbone of the everyday research routine. I would ask you whether you think that this should somehow become a technical, let's say, part of the technical background of every person doing research. So something that would facilitate and allow you to do research in the next 10 or 15 years, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, using at least one programming language, no matter if it was MATLAB or some SPSS knowledge, changed the way in which researcher approached their everyday research routine. So my point is to ask whether you think that this should be something that most of the people should know to do research in the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I personally completely agree. Using version control tools has so many advantages for science that we've talked about. Both, even if you just keep it local for yourself, but also if you do collaborative open science, that beyond science, actually, it also increases your skill set. Yeah, beyond science. So that's also something that I want to add here. I think it definitely has the potential to make science so much better. I think we should train our researchers in it and highlight the advantages. But when you use version control, even if you're not a researcher anymore, you will have advantages for the rest of your life. It's a highly employable technical skill, and very beneficial in all areas of work that you can end up even after you may have left science.
I totally agree as well. I think as well that in this moment, we are at a stage in which having some knowledge of version control is fairly easy. And interacting with version control is fairly easy. So it's not something that you need a lot of experience, a previous experience to work with. We can discuss about this, but I'm one of the promoter of better that you do it, even if not in the best way, than you don't do it at all. So sometimes I have some scuffles about some colleague of mine because they say, no, you have to use Git with the terminal, and there's no other way to do it because that's the only way you can learn. And it's true, it's the best way to learn it, because then you become familiar with the terminology and etc. But we have other programs now that do that for you, and that are very easy to interact with. It's like, I think that nowadays it's fairly easy to find researchers that can program at least in one language, while maybe, as you were saying, like 10 years ago, that was a good requirement. That was something that was important because it was making you different from your colleagues. I think that nowadays we are at that stage for version control systems. And I think that version control systems can improve a lot the interaction, well, the workflow interaction in a laboratory. For instance, being able to review what my students do in online and just giving them a command instead of having to wait for the next meeting that we have together in a week. For instance, that's really something that helps. Or being able to track our conversations about maybe some suggestion that I gave them or some suggestion that they gave me. That's very important as well. And actually, I always had the experience of Git and GitHub and version control systems in international collaboration groups, but I think that, Adina, you have experience in a lab, and
yeah.
And if so, like how did it actually change for you using version control in a lab?
So the fun thing is that our research institute provides a GitLab instance, and we basically switched the complete institute to use this GitLab instance to coordinate anything. That includes all of our large-scale data management, that includes all of the infrastructure things, that includes the HR. When a new person is hired, a new intern is hired, then you have a GitHub organization that is specifically tasked with that, and then the responsible PI goes and opens an issue that relays all of the necessary information about the person that will come to our institute. And then the team has a structured record of this because we have little bots that make sure that all of the metadata that is provided in different templates is actually accurate, that the email address is resolved, and so forth. And when a student needs access to a specific data set that we do not make available on our cluster, then they submit what is called an issue with a dataset request, so that our data management team can come in and make sure to retrieve the data and structure it and make it available, and then document how to actually access the data. And then when someone has a project finished, then they can do a data archival request where they say, hey, I've made this Git repository with my dataset. It contains all of the data, it contains all of the code. And here I open this basic issue with all of this metadata. Which publication does this data relate to? Which people were involved? What are the email addresses of the primary and secondary and tertiary authors? And what are the affiliations? And then also that metadata is checked, and it creates a snapshot of the linked dataset. And that is then transferred to permanent storage for our institute, where it's then archived for hopefully at least 10 years. And the advantage of that in the context of that question is impressive knowledge gains for all of the trainees that we have. Because any single new PhD student, bachelor student, internship student, and also, frankly, the established PIs that haven't been bothered yet to learn those technical tools yet, they need to interact with GitLab instances, with issues, with also stuff maybe like pull request, like not necessarily, not on a regular basis, but it is there. And they, by this necessity, learn on the job without needing to get any specific course. And that's something that I think a lot of people will find beneficial once they leave the institute for the next academic job to an institution where this skill is highly valued. So thanks for asking. But I think the way that you do it with your trainees and students is quite similar, organizational style. But I think there is a great question in the chat.
What are the cons and pros of using GUI platforms for version control, like GitHub Desktop for Windows? Any other suggestions? Thanks.
It's definitely a question for Stefano.
What are the cons and what are the pros? Cons, and actually this is an important cons, and that's probably the only reason for which I would say don't do that. You will not learn as easily and transparently Git as you should. It's very easy to gain knowledge about Git by using Git, and the basic commands should be learned by heart at the very least, because when you're not on your computer, if that happens, or when you're in a computer that doesn't have any of those GUI, you have to be able to do that if you want to. And if you are used to the GUI alone, then you cannot do it as easily as you should. For more difficult tasks, maybe it's not so necessary, but it's good to know what is happening and what are the commands and what is the syntax. And luckily, at the moment, most of the programs that I know that interface with Git do, at the very least, cover this information. It's also transparent if they give it to you at all. There's one very, very good exception, and that's the exception that I use. But can we say names, Vittorio? Or yeah, okay. So just knowing that I'm not sponsored by them, but as I say every time, if they want to sponsor me, I'm happy to take that sponsor. I, for instance, use Sublime Merge, and that's a piece of software. That's a piece of software that you saw in my presentation before. That's a piece of software that is very easy to use and very easy to interface. It's available for, I think, all of the platforms, not just for Windows or Linux or stuff like that. And that actually has access to the history of the commands that you would give in when you click on buttons. The pros are many. The first one is that it becomes much easier to interact, and it's not just with the terminal. For instance, at this point, I use just basically my keyboard, but like just strokes of my keyboard. It's like the Control V and Control C for copy pasting. I do a Control R and they have all of the history of my position and stuff like that, and that's great because then it becomes far more easy and far more fast to do Git in this moment. For the rest, I'm not familiar with GitHub Desktop because I don't use Windows, so I'm sorry I cannot tell you much about it. Many new editors have an integrated system to work with Git. For instance, VS Code. For instance, Atom. They were actually based on Git, so it's the best way to interact with them. RStudio gives you the ability to do that. So there's many ways to do it. But learn the basic commands by heart on the terminal, just in case. It's good.
So I think I'll just read the thanks to the cons and thanks Adina for remote now, a super powerful Java tool. I don't know, it's I would say you're suggesting basically to use tools with an integrated Git, let's say patch or whatever, instead of using desktop tools. And this was just rephrasing. I would say that my experience was limited just to desktop tool for dealing with Gin. And while on the other hand, I think it's kind of like handy because it's there. You just copy and paste files and he keeps track of all the stuff. When everything works, it's so, But if something is not working, then it's basically impossible to understand where the process stopped, and then you have versions and files that pops out, and then your computer stops, and then you have in 2022, 2022, the blue screens of that, and so on. It's a bit difficult to see what's going on. So there is this kind of paradox that if you are kind of like 100% sure that everything is working, then I think a GUI tool, it could be like a good choice. But if you're not 100% sure, then I think it's definitely the worst choice you could pick. And as far as if you are a beginner, it's very unlikely that 100% you are 100% sure of what's happening. So maybe it's not the most relevant choice for a beginner.
Sorry, to answer and to be a bit more specific, because maybe that was not clear in my answer before. Using integrated tools definitely makes Git easier. But I actually do advocate to, if you're using GUI, use GUIs that are transparent. So for instance, Sublime Merge is actually a desktop tool. It's not integrated. but it is transparent. So when I click a button, I know what I'm like. If I want, I know what I'm doing. Like honestly, that's how I learned how to do neuroimaging analysis, because I was running FSL from a GUI and then I was reading the commands in the terminal, and that way I learned how to do it. And now maybe I'm not using FSL anymore, but at least I know what I was doing and I learned it through it. And I think that it's the same for Git. And so if you find a tool that makes your life easier in using Git, adopt it. If it's transparent, double adopt it, because that's going to make you learn what you're doing when you want. Because yes, that's as you were saying, Vittorio. Otherwise, if something happens, it's going to become like the blue screen of death that I forgot about being moved away from Windows since like 10 years. But it's actually a nightmare. So yeah, don't do that. Yeah.
What I would maybe add to this, and I think Stefano has already answered on Vittorio as well, the complete question. But I would answer this in response also to this comment on Windows. I think terminals are intimidating, rightly so, to many people, because most of us are young enough to grow up in an age where, well, the computers kind of evolved their user interface that tried to make everything as convenient as possible for the users, and everything that we do is only apps. And if you have a Windows computer or a Mac, and you have students to train and that use those tools, then you might find students that don't know what a file hierarchy is or how their file system really works, simply because they're not used to it, because the search tools of their desktops are so powerful. So with that kind of learning environment that we grew up with and grew into science with, I think it's kind of understandable that the terminal has an intimidating touch to it. And it's also definitely not easy to get this mental concept of distributed version control right in your head when you have to memorize like weird Git commands. So personally, I would encourage everyone, whatever tool you want to use, if it's a graphical user interface for Git, if it makes you more comfortable, then man, yeah, it makes you more productive. It opens up your way into version control. But I also want to stress that there are ways to overcome the fear of terminals. And that's easy to say for me because I already did it and I know how hard it is when you're just starting. I also know how hard it is when you just have the, like, I don't know, CMD on Windows or a non-maintained cluster where you just have a very basic profile and everything is ugly. But you can use really nice tools that make the interactions with your terminal nicer. And for this, I, for example, can really recommend TIG, TIG. It's like Git, but spelled backwards. And that's a really nice way of visualizing the Git revision history. So the screenshots that I've shown you, they are TIG screenshots. And then depending on what kind of terminal you use, so I use what is called a Z shell. There are many great plugins for your terminal's profile that add little nifty features, for example, an indication on which branch you're on in your Git repository, or whether there are any staged or unchecked contents present. And that already allows you to make the complete terminal experience a little bit nicer. But apart from that, I really don't want to gatekeep anyone. The terminal is the most powerful tool you can have, and you can. It really has many advantages using it. But any kind of tool that gets you started and gets you productive has definitely its value. So go for it.
Maybe just I would ask you just a very quick comment, maybe a generic comment related to multi-lab studies. My humble opinion, I think they should be more and more common in the next few years, because now we have an infrastructure, we have an interoperable way to arrange data, to exchange data, and so on and so forth. So if you have comments from your side related to the aspects you discussed in your contribution, whether version control is going to be, in my opinion, like the game changer for enabling more and more multi-lab studies all over the planet.
I'll try to answer briefly, and I can completely agree. Also, because we are doing it in this way, we participants in quite a number of multi-institute consortia, multi-lab studies, and there's always the difficulty of how do we integrate these different data acquisitions. They come from different scanners, they come from different sites, they come from different modalities, they come from different studied subjects, from animals, from humans, and so forth. And by using version control and the services associated with them, it gives us an interface where we can aggregate all of the data sources together and have data sources, like specifically when we use version control for data, that allow us to create the data resource from multiple labs that we actually need.
And honestly, the reason for which I learned how to use Git was to do organization and collaboration with other international partners and labs. And I think that being able to share your code, being able to easily share your data and give access in the most easy way that is independent from you and the physical restrictions that we have is the best way to start this kind of multi-lab studies that are indeed necessary and so much more informative than what we can do singularly at our own institutions. So yeah, definitely. It's Git. I would learn Git just for that, honestly, just to be able to do it. So yeah.